Well, thank you so much to everybody for joining in. So this session is the reality of roasting, so being a more decisive roaster. So just a quick, I wanted to pop this slide up just in case we didn't have time at the end. So you can scan this QR code that will take you through to my website, where you'll be able to see a little bit more about myself, some of the consulting options that I offer, and also some great group coaching options as well. So yeah, a little bit more about myself there. But yeah, I'll keep this introduction nice and short and sweet, because I have a pretty ambitious sort of hour ahead. But I really wanted to use this session because I've really been inspired by my consulting and all the different situations and levels of experience and people that I come across and meet. And so we're going to use the topic of being decisive while we're roasting as the backbone, because it's definitely one of the things that we all want to know about how to do, a lot better, in our roasting. And so you can see here, we've got all these questions about how do I start? How do I finish? Who do I listen to? But why? How do I know I've made the right decisions? How do I know I'm on the right track? Everything looks perfect on the screen. Why doesn't it taste right? Can I do the same approach for everything? And then, of course, we do hear things like, I like to drink coffee. I'll get into roasting. How hard can it be? And I think definitely our current situation that we find ourselves in with with COVID and a lot of people turning their attention to coffee, I've really found myself having to, in lots of training sessions and dealing with a lot of newcomers to the industry, really having to really thoroughly explain even more what's going on, and trying to clear up any potential confusion that may have come about from these newcomers reading a book or watching a video. So the first half of this session is just going to be a really good, honest, open reminder about what we're focusing on in our roasting, and that's then going to lead up to the last part of the presentation, where I've actually recorded myself roasting, and so we'll go through watching a profile, and I'm going to be stopping and starting the video and chatting about everything that I was looking at. What did I decide to do? How did I know what to do? So that'll be quite, exciting. So I'll keep an eye on the time and make sure we've got plenty of time to watch that video, and then have time for questions at the end. And I really love, as Rob pointed out in his presentation, in terms of context, really reminding ourselves that, there's many different approaches and situations in our industry. And I'll try my best to make sure that I really clarify the context in what I'm offering in terms of the information to be looking at. So what is the goal of coffee roasting? I mean, we've already heard some amazing presentations so far, really helping us to better understand everything that's going on in our coffee roasting. But more than anything, really, coffee is, roasting is cooking. Besides turning beans brown, we're applying heat to change the structure of molecules at a certain rate over time. We're encouraging chemical reactions to alter and create flavors. But ultimately, as we've been discovering, we're making delicious things with science, and we're creating something to be tasted. But we do sort of come across, a little bit of that. Well, it is a craft, it is a skill, it can be learnt. How hard can it be? So we kind of do come across those that kind of think, we've got the romance of roasting. I come across many people that think that, oh, we're just going to be standing at the roaster, the machine's going to do all the work, and we'll just be smelling our whole way through the roast. But then, of course, as we know, for those of us that really get into roasting, there's that element of the reality of roasting. It's hot, it's dry, we make awesome mistakes where we drop green into roasted. There's the lovely maintenance schedule where we have to get underneath cooling trays and get dirty and dusty. It's very physical, lots of lifting, you burn your lip. And then, of course, we do things by trying to roast, an enormous amount of production on a small roaster. So you can see here, we're about to do a very big production day, and there's all the packing and all the beyond the cooling tray side of things. So, and then there's also, we've got to remember, this is really only looking at what I would call very small production. This is only about 100 kilos, but it's being post-blended. So in terms of reminding ourselves about the all of the OH and S all of the physical, how many times do you want to touch the coffee before you actually start packing it? And then, yeah, so there's a lot of double handling, a lot of movement with that coffee before we even sort of, get to that packing stage. And then, of course, the tasting. And I'm really loving how in the presentations there's a constant sort of comment going back to, reminding ourselves about the importance of tasting. So you can find a really awesome article that I wrote for Roast Magazine in the May-June issue of last year called True to Taste, about production roast evaluation. And I'm really passionate about roasters evaluating their coffee properly and tasting it properly, and making sure that we've got the opportunity to really tie back to our profile in an appropriate way. And one thing I'm really passionate about with tasting is not necessarily always scoring our production roasts. Is really more honing in on the intensity, because that's what we're doing when we're roasting. We're changing the intensity of certain aspects. And so we really need to understand better what we've done in terms of, changing that intensity, and cupping is 100%, that tasting process is really important, because we've got to remember we're creating something to be tasted. And of course, reminding ourselves that we're in the business of flavor. Taste is, the ultimate, pinnacle of everything that we're doing. So I know I blasted through that really quickly, but let's get to it. How do I become a more decisive roaster? Know the purpose, know your green, know your machine, know your profile and your heat strategy, know the intended end product and the flavors that you're trying to roast. So know the purpose of why and what you are roasting. What origin, character, or flavors do you want to showcase? What customer base and cultural palette and product line is the roasted coffee destined for? Knowing this, you will then better understand how to decide the quality and the grade of green required, how much roasted coffee you need to produce, the batch size required, and of course, what size roaster you'll need, to what roast level the coffee is to be roasted to, and thus how to then create a profile or a cooking or a heat management strategy on your specific roasting system. So there's lots of decisions already before we even start roasting. So let's start with knowing our green. So knowing our green is really important in terms of we need to analyze and know everything about it before we start roasting. It's really imperative as roasters that we understand the moisture content, the water activity, the density, the screen size, and the flavor notes. And I guess why? The most important thing that we need to know why is because one thing, especially with things like moisture content, well, actually, I should clarify for myself. I use screen size, moisture content, and batch size as a way to start indicating on how to start a roast. And then I use knowledge about density and process when I'm moving through into first crack and for the back end of the roast. So really reminding ourselves about things like, it was really great hearing about, the water activity and then the conductivity of the moisture content in the first presentation, because for myself, I use moisture content as a reminder because water acts as a catalyst. How do I need to activate that water in order to be able to then start turning that water into steam pressure, get that bit into first crack, and then really start moving through the stages for the rest of the roast. So then that really starts that first process of understanding how much energy do I need to apply to that specific bean with specific properties. So different, there were some questions about different bits of equipment to be, that we can use for measuring moisture content and density. This is just an example of some different origins with different measurements in terms of, we've got moisture content on the top and then density measurements down the bottom. So we were hearing measurements of between 10 to 12% for moisture content. And then in terms of density, I tend to turn my measurements into kilograms per hectolitre. So I'm working on anything that's above 70 kilograms per hectolitre, I consider to be starting to be moving into the hard or dense range. Anything that's below 70, I consider to be in the softer range. So then that starts giving me an idea about my heat strategy, again, heading into first crack and how to start managing that. And then, of course, you don't have to have a fancy, bit of equipment like this. You can make yourself a 250 ml density tube and take yourself through those, the measurement with that 250 ml tube. It is really important to, if you do have multiple or different bits of equipment in your roastery, is just understanding some of the differences that they can present, between them. And just a really good example popped up recently in the Cropster webinar that we did, and we had a coffee from Ally, and it was really interesting seeing the measurements that came from Ally versus the measurements that some of us got in our own roasteries. So it's really important to remind ourselves that the conditions in which you're doing your measurements will really potentially influence the way that your equipment performs, especially in terms of temperature. These bits of equipment are very sensitive to differences in temperature. So just know that the data you're collecting is specific to your actual, setup. Bear in mind too, it's always good to also have a really good positive conversation with your trader if you do see a very big difference in readings. So don't be afraid to reach out and, get them to help you really understand what their measurements mean versus the measurements that you're getting in your roastery. Knowing our machine. So this is where it really also then now starts to, play a really important role in our whole decision-making process. So we, obviously, with Rob's awesome chat about getting to know about the airflow, the types of exhaust that we have on our roasters, what kind of type of roaster do we have, what brand, and even between in the same brand, there'll be differences in series as well. So differences in build quality, controls and gauges. We're learning a lot more about the impact of hardware on our probes, different burner types, the kind of fuel type that you're using, your type of burner arrays, the design of your burner, the kind of pressure that's coming in as well, cooling tray design, drum material and drum type. So all of these play a massive role, again, in, starting that whole decision process. And how do I know how to start roasting this coffee? What do I start focusing on? And so another great thing, touching on all of the community myths. There's lots of myths to bust in our industry. And one in particular is the differences in the machines. And so again, another great bit of research and an article that I wrote with Rob called "Can You Taste the Roasting System?", where we set about trying to bust that myth of that the machine is the element that creates flavor, when actually it's your profile that influences flavor. So you can read about that research in the May-June issue in 2019. You'll also see copies of the articles on my website as well. So, but yeah, again, really going through and sort of like reinforcing that it's really about, knowing your system, knowing how to drive it, and then your profile is what will influence, not necessarily, buy this machine, get this kind of flavor. So, really, working your way through understanding that. And then, of course, touching on probes. We've got to remember when we're looking at, purchasing a roaster and wanting to get a specific machine, we should also be looking at the kind of probes that are installed on these machines. You can see here on a P-series probat, a roaster has made the mistake up here of putting their bean probe up too high. And then on this probat in the middle, which is actually the P12 that I use, we accidentally put the exhaust probe a little bit up too high, but on the wrong side of the hopper. And you'll see that when we do the live roasting, you'll see the exhaust just dipping a little bit every time the trier comes out. And then, of course, just in terms of different thicknesses, different types, of course, positioning, our understanding and working with probes has just become leaps and bounds, definitely in the last few years, in terms of understanding their influence and their value in how they're really helping us focus on our roasting. And then in terms of like the curve and the profile. So with our roast curve, it's kind of like our roadmap. So the roast curve helps to give a physical representation of the feedback from the probe and the green coffee as it changes over time in response to the application of heat. Whereas our profile is our cooking strategy. This is everything to do with us creating our own specific flavor. So the desired roasting temperatures and the rates at which to achieve time-sensitive milestones and data points. And these must be then connected to a physical change or a chemical reaction, which in then turns creates our specific, flavor and our roast profile. And this is what I, tell to roasters that this is the intellectual property you want to protect. So someone can walk into your roastery and see curves on the screen, it doesn't matter. But if they see the way that you're taking your coffee through the different stages and the timing, and then of course get to learn the color, then that can be easily replicated. Now, another really great document that I like to show in terms of decision points is, how do you plan and think your way through? And so this is something that I did with Cropster in a webinar recently on how to use rate of rise appropriately in your production. So there'll be an article coming out on that, I think, in the next week or so. But this, for example, is a decision points page I put together for one of my milk-based espresso profiles. And you can see here how it's reiterating in terms of how I'm using batch size, moisture content, screen size, and how to start the roast. And then I'm giving myself little rules. So each star has a rule that I need to follow in the context of my roaster and my probe. What do I not want to be doing at certain points? And I think kind of how Rob said, there's certain things in the industry that we say and that we don't like hearing. One thing that I really breaks my heart to hear is things like, don't take any notice of the turning point. I often just then say to roasters, well, you know what? It's a data point. It's there. Let's use it, and let's use it to our advantage because it is a really great data point to use in terms of, especially when you want to change batch sizes. It really helps you frame up a specific charge temp, when to introduce heat, and then how you can then consistently keep your different batch sizes turning at the same time and temperature. And then along the way, I really love having like a 3-minute momentum check. What kind of temperature do I want to be sitting at? So we'll be reminding ourselves about that as we head in towards watching the video. And then through first crack, I've also got a various different range of a rate of rise rate at each point, which will clarify as we get into watching the video. But I just want to quickly pose a question. There's many different variables, equipment, and styles when it comes to roasting coffee. So where do we even start, and what variables should be paid more attention to, and which ones should be mostly left alone? And I would definitely say more focus on the phases, the rate of rise rate, time and degrees, and less focus on development ratio percentages. So that brings up an example of, and I think I loved how Joey was sort of like, saying it briefly before in terms of, are you roasting the software or are you roasting the coffee in the roaster? So I find I really have to remind a lot of roasters in terms of, when you're focusing only on, a specific data point on your screen and nothing else, then you're not really understanding why your flavors aren't working, then you've really got to remind yourself about and this is where the phases come into play. It's about the sequential, the linear progression of how we're actually cooking the coffee. How are we turning those beans brown? How are we going from green to color change or yellow through to first crack, and then how are we finalizing and defining our end? And so on the left here, we've got a really good example where a roaster was only focusing on a straight rate of rise line, nothing else. And for the purposes of this presentation, we had a chat with the roaster, and we had to work out where would they have called color change. And then you can really see then in comparison to the profile on the right. So these were both intended for espresso. And so the one on the left was getting very consistent feedback about low body, low sweetness, being very dry, tart, and a bitter finish. Whereas the one on the right had feedback about high body, high sweetness, juicy acidity, and a very balanced finish. And the main reason is we start breaking it down into analysing the timing of these phases. timing is everything. So you can really see there's a very big difference between, the timing of the green, the timing in Maillard in particular was very, very short, as opposed to a little bit longer on the second one. So showing a lot of value in taking more notice in your cooking strategy and the timing and how you're taking yourself through the roast. And then, of course, with the research that Rob and I did with Can You Taste the Roasting System, where we had the same coffee, the same profile, different machines, but the same end flavors and the same color. So we were very focused on, we get asked all the time, by roasters, what's the best machine to buy? How do I know, or how can I transfer from machine to machine, my profile and have the coffees tasting the same? And again, it's really all about matching the timing of those phases. So again, just showing a lot of value in, really watching, your cooking strategy and the timing, and of course, then backing it up by tasting and then showing yourself why you like that flavor. So, and again, as I often say, the timing of these phases, this is the intellectual property, for your flavors, not the lines on the screen. So another great experiment that Rob and I did together is where we had the same first crack and end temperature. We had the same development ratio percentage, but different overall roast times and very different end flavors. So this was to sort of help roasters really better understand the value in not defining your roast by development ratio percentage. It's very dangerous. There's a lot going on after first crack in terms of time and degrees. So this was a great way to kind of show roasters that, just a bit of a zoom in there on the profile, but just you can really see the differences in the time. So one roast was almost total time 12 minutes, another one was almost 10 minutes, and then the third one was 8 minutes 40. But they all had, a very similar development ratio percentage. And I see this a lot in roasting teams, and especially with a lot of people learning how to roast. They get very confused and fixated on, but they think they're right because the development ratio percentage is what it's supposed to be, but they're not understanding why it tastes wrong. And that's because they're not taking notice then, of course, of how they got there. So just be really mindful about, focusing on just development ratio percentage when you're defining your roasting. There's a lot more going on in the profile, as we're going to get to see in a moment. So then again, so now heading into, framing up our roast for, watching this profile is data is knowledge, knowledge is power, and especially in roasting. We all make notes. I don't know about you guys, but I've got a truckload of bits of paper with roasting steps and notes and all sorts of things everywhere. But it's about making sure that we show ourselves the right kind of data. So it's really important. It doesn't matter whether you're using software or note taking or other ways of recording your roasts. It's really important that you show yourself with like a daily roast log sheet and show yourself and write down the right information in terms of your yellows times, your Maillard times, your first crack times, your end times and temperatures, your degrees from first crack to the end of the roast, and your development time, along with your ratio percentage, your weighing your green, getting your weight losses, and your color measurements. So this is good data. And you can also see I'm planning my day with my roast log in terms of I've got different charge temperatures for different beans. No doubt also because those specific beans have, different moisture content, different screen size, and they do require a slightly, different beginning in order to keep them on track with the profile that I have in mind. So you can see here I've got then it filled out. And then what I would do then when I'm heading into my QC and my cupping and my tasting, I then, after tasting, would highlight my favorite roast. And then you're going to show yourself your key data points. Why do I like this profile? Why do I like these flavors? And then you've got this information to then go back to, example, your software, where you have that profile recorded with all of your heat management steps, your heat strategy, your grass steps, whatever adjustments you made. So then you can mark that profile and keep on, consistently replaying and doing that profile over and over again. So the right kind of data is super important. Now, another great thing where this data can go to is then you can create for yourself a table of parameters. Now, this is something that I do for myself and for clients, and it's a really great way for you to really define your flavor preferences, your brand, your flavors, something that you can really stand by. But please, please remember that this data has been created on a specific machine with a specific probe and also with a specific flavor preference. So for example, this is just me highlighting from my previous roast log sheet. I'm then coming to my parameters chart and confirming that did I hit all of the marks that I was aiming for, and is it in line with my parameters chart? Now, this chart was created after summarizing a lot of information on the roast log sheets, a lot of cupping and tasting, and I love how Joey reinforced that. But then you've got to go back and highlight your favorite roast. Then you've got an amazing set of data points to work with in your profile. So then this is a Fahrenheit example. So there is, one there for to refer to as well. But let's just quickly remind ourselves again, what's measured and recorded during a roast. Of course, we've got our charge, our start or our drop and end temperatures, our bean temperature, our rate of rise or the rate of the bean temperature change, our air or exhaust temperature, our heat application or our heat management strategy, turnaround point, the color and the physical change points, first crack, second crack, and then other system control changes, for example, like airflow and whatnot, things that are very specific to your system. And then let's just quickly touch on color change. So this is definitely something I'm quite passionate about in terms of marking color change in the roast. It really breaks my heart to hear out there in the industry, there is, comments made that, don't look at the coffee. It's an old school technique to look at the coffee. This is where we've really got to understand, especially for those of you wanting to get into roasting, it's a reminder that we need the data on the screen, but we also need the sensory in the roaster as well. And I think Rob also reinforced that as well. It's really important that it's then us learning, when do we look at the coffee in the roaster? When do we look at the data on the screen? And then how do we make a decision about what to do in that roast? So it just, color change, it doesn't do it justice on here, but I really, when I call color change, I wait until everything is really full gold. I find that for me, that's a really consistent way for calling that point in the roast. And then in terms of, before we move on to the video, this is the context of the machine that I'll be using in the video. So it's a P12 Series 2. It has an electronic control panel, so you can see here in terms of percentage for adjusting the heat. It's natural gas. It has a premix power burner, so it is mostly an indirect style of burner. It has a cast iron faceplate, definitely not the drum. That is another major myth that needs to be busted in the industry. So there is no such thing as a cast iron drum. All of the drums will always be a form of mild steel or stainless steel. It's a double wall solid mild steel drum. The drum spins anti-clockwise. It has a fixed RPM and the airflow can be adjusted by the rear baffle. I do have my baffle setting to a point where I'm really only doing seasonal adjustments with that baffle. There is a temperature cutout at 250 degrees Celsius. There's a 3mm K-type probe. There is a default, and I've also post-installed a probe you can see here lower in the door, and also an exhaust probe up here on the left. And then I'm also using Cropster software as my main data reference. So I do use the software for my temperature indicators. I don't use the control panel. The only time I use the control panel is for the temperature high cutout, because it's really important, more so when we're doing bigger batch sizes. And then lastly, before we head into watching the profile, know your profile flavors. What is your cooking or your heat management strategy? So for me, I'm going to be roasting or dialing in actually a brand new coffee. The roast that we're going to watch is only the second time that I've had a chance to roast this coffee. So these are the rules that I'm going to be giving myself. It's a 4 kilo batch size. So I'll be focusing on making sure that the turning point doesn't go below 70 degrees. I want to be hitting yellow around this temperature, 160, 165, in a time range between 5 to 6 minutes. And I want a rate of rise of about 15 degrees per minute. I do really want to try and get at least 4 minutes between yellow and first crack. And, you know, I don't know where this bean is going to hit crack. It will be approximately in this 202 to 204 zone in about 9 to 10 minutes. And in terms of rate of rise, I want to be heading into first crack with about a 6 degree per minute rate of rise. Now, in terms of how to finish, this is where I use my parameters chart. And just reminding ourselves that, you know, it's probe specific as well, and system specific in terms of how I drive this roast. So my goal, so we're roasting a Mexico Nayarita. It's a natural process, 10.7% moisture content, 68 kilograms per hectoliter on the density, and a screen size of 17 to 18. And the notes that I'll be really wanting to try and, you know, accentuate is a blueberry sweetness, blackberry acidity, and rich silky body. So my parameters is I'll be working on, you know, getting to yellow in this time frame, 4.5 to 5 minutes, yellow to first crack between 3.5 to 4 minutes. And then mostly after first crack, I'm going to be focusing very hard on only about between 5 and 6 degrees in about 1.5 minutes. But a lot of this will make a lot more sense now as we head into the video. So I'm just going to move this screen down so I can see a bit better. Okay. So with framing up this 4 kilo roast. So again, really reinforcing, as Rob mentioned in his presentation about preparing the machine. So when I do a 4 kilo roast, I actually need to wait quite a long time for the system to cool down. So you can see here on the bottom right-hand corner, 9 minutes 57. It was probably a little bit longer for my in-between batch protocol. So I'm actually letting the fan of the roaster naturally pull the energy out of the system before I then start doing a little bit of tricking on the probe and stuff like that. So my idling bean temperature, I needed it to get down to about 165 degrees, and my idling exhaust temperature was 159. And that's super important. When I'm batching up and down from doing like a 10 kilo batch down to a 4 kilo batch, it's really important that the exhaust temperature gets down as low as I need it to be. If I was to start and the exhaust was 170, and my bean temperature, I managed to get down to 165, then the whole roast will just keep on going too hot and it won't follow my profile as intended. And now I have the list of steps on the side here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try my best to talk through this profile. And I guess, having this kind of like online, format with the Roast Summit, hopefully watching this profile can bring in a little bit of, reminiscing of standing next to the roaster and having a bit more of a practical hands-on approach to the roasting, as like what we would be doing, if we were all meeting together, in person. So let's get this video started. So you'll see, in preparation, I am actually opening the door of the roaster in order to bring it down in temperature because I'd already hit my 165 idling temp. You'll see a point where the door closes and the temperature starts going up. I'm going to drop in the roast at 125 degrees. And then, so you'll see, that's me then making a note. I'm currently sitting on 0% gas. So now the coffee has dropped into the roaster, and you'll start to see the temperature falling. When we get to about 3 minutes, I'll just quickly explain for those of you that aren't used to seeing software about what the lines are indicating. Now, my first goal, the reason why I chose a specific starting temperature was because I want to be turning no lower than 70 degrees. So then I'm waiting about 30 seconds. and then I'm going to turn the heat up to 60%. So again, based on a lot of trial and error and a lot of experience, I've worked out with the 4 kilo batch sizes that if I start with a certain temperature and a certain heat management routine, I can then get that batch size to drop in and turn at a specific temperature. And then understanding, well, how do I know that 60% is the right amount of, heat to turn up to? So then my next goal is my 3-minute checkpoint. So at 3 minutes on a 4 kilo batch size, my goal is to be anywhere between 120 to 125 degrees. So then I use the first 3 minutes of my roast as a really great way to start framing up my momentum and my preparation, framing up the right amount of energy for the rest of the roast. So if I miss the mark at 3 minutes, then I wouldn't be afraid. If I was too slow, I would not be afraid to stop the roast and start again. If I was ahead, then I know I need to start then doing some management and control to get that on track. Because then we're going to start then really focusing on the rate of rise over here underneath the bean temperature. I do set my rate of rise to a 60-second time expression, and I use the recommended rate of rise setting in Cropster. So while we've still got a minute to get to 3 minutes, you will see, for those of you that aren't used to seeing software, the red line is measuring the exhaust or the hot air. The blue line is measuring the bean temperature. And then the blue line that's kicking up in the background here is the rate of rise expression or setting. So that's the visual representation of the rate at which the bean temperature is changing. And then this other red line is then the rate of rise for the exhaust, which we're going to talk a little bit more about towards as we get through the roast. So again, it's really important that you have your software set up appropriately so you can really start interpreting and working with that, with your profile and getting to your desired checkpoints at the right time with the right speed. So now we're getting close to 3 minutes. So remember, my goal was to be at least between 120 to 125 degrees. And it looks like we're going to be sitting at about 123. So happy days. So I'm very happy with that. So then I say to myself, awesome. So starting at 125 with 0 gas, a 30-second soak, and then going up to 60% has set me up for success now for the rest of the roast. So now we need to work out, well, how on earth do I know now what's next? How do I know when to start turning down the gas? So this is where I really start to use the rate of rise on the exhaust. So you can see here, there was a slight kick in the energy on the rate of rise. Now, for me, generally on my roasts, that will always generally start to happen around the 130 mark. So from about 130 degrees, I'm then on my way down in terms of turning down the gas. So pretty much every time now there's a major kick in the exhaust on the rate of rise here, I'm then turning down my gas percentage, because my next goal after my 3-minute checkpoint is to get to yellow at least by 5 minutes. And I want to have a rate of rise of about between 14 to 15 degrees per minute. That's my goal now, between 3 and 5 minutes. So this is me with a specific cooking strategy in mind. Because I also know that this cooking strategy is going to give me a specific flavour. And remembering that I want to highlight blueberry sweetness, blackberry acidity, and a nice silky body in this coffee. So, and I know that the timing of this specific cooking strategy is going to give me that. So that's my goal with these dialing in roasts specifically. So as we're getting closer, we're going to start heading, into the yellowing stages. Now, it's also important that you know your machine and you know your probe. Now, it's really important that you know that, because I guess what I'm getting at is, when do you touch the trier? Because it was really great again. A lot of the presenters were recognizing there's a right time and a wrong time, I think, to be touching your trier. So you can see here, I've just marked color change. I'm just going to stop the video briefly. So if I had have touched my trier before calling yellow, like with Rob, I would have dips in my exhaust readout. So I know on my roaster approximately when to start touching the trier. So then I can then start looking at the color change and really getting to know this specific bean. So when I called yellow, so I called yellow at 165, pardon me, 163, pardon me. And my rate of rise was between my 14 to 15 degrees per minute. So far, everything's tracking along quite beautifully. And the gas steps that I'm choosing to help me along the way are also helping as well. So remember that the only reason gas steps get created is so that we can drive from point to point at the right rate. Okay, so we're at yellow. So now our next goal is to think about how do we get this bean to first crack? So again, knowing that we've only got 4 kilos rolling around in the drum, I'm then, working with the energy in the roaster. So every time there's a kick in the exhaust rate of rise, that's an indication to me to start thinking about then turning down the heat from the burner. So basically, as the bean temperature is increasing progressively throughout the roast, we then need to be then sort of like taking away the help from the burners, because we've also got a wonderful amount of energy built up here in the exhaust that we can start drawing on. So definitely I find from yellow onwards, there's a really good reliance now on more of the convection energy in the roaster. So as a rule for yourself, the only reason you can turn down your burner is if you have enough energy built up in your exhaust. So again, then like learning through trial and error, how do I know? Because at the moment I'm moving in 5% increments on my gas adjustments down. And I've just learnt with this particular batch size, that will then allow me to get the bean to move through into first crack at the right rate, at the right time. I'm going to be cooking the coffee at the right rate. And then my next fun will be when I get to first crack, how do I finish this? Because as a lot of you are learning with your roasting, and even for us as experienced roasters, the most terrifying part of roasting is knowing how to start and knowing how to finish. For me, they're the most dynamic parts of the roast. You can generally, find the middle part of your roast can be quite stable and quite reliable. So having those decision points in place in terms of planning your roast, having a desired speed or rate at which you want to be moving at a certain part in the roast, getting to a particular event at a specific time, and then you're basically just driving your machine from point to point at the right rate. So that's really then drawing on like knowing your green, knowing your machine, like how do you control your roaster to move this coffee at the right rate. So now we're heading close, getting into the zone, setting up for first crack. So we're actually not too far away. So that should be happening around, it'll be around 204. So we've still got about, about 12 degrees to go. So again, the only thing I'm doing between color change and first crack is as the bean temperature is gradually increasing, I'm then decreasing the energy from the burner. So then I can then get the beans to then crack and then have them cracking at the right rate. That's the ultimate goal of creating gas steps, and to have that happen at the right time. So my goal is to get the beans to be cracking with a rate of rise of at least 6 degrees per minute. Because once I hit first crack, I really only want to be then moving about 5 or 6 degrees in about a minute and a half. So then I need to then design a heat management strategy to then move that 5 or 6 degrees in that specific amount of time. Okay, so we can see we're getting ready, only about 4 degrees away now. And then we'll talk about calling first crack. So I do wait until I hear consecutive pops when I call first crack. You will hear what we call little outliers, or I call them ghosty pops. So I really wait and make sure I'm very certain that the beans are cracking before I call it. So pretty soon you'll see me marking first crack. There's first crack. And you can see we've got a rate of rise. It was about 6.5 degrees, which is perfect. So I'm in my 6 to 6.5 degree range. So, and I called first crack. And we'll talk about when we finish about my thoughts on this roast and how it went. So now I say to myself, first crack happened at 204.3. So then I plant the idea of an end temperature. So I want to get a minimum of 5 degrees from this temperature. So my end temperature is going to be 209.3, probably no more than 210. And I want to achieve that in now a minute and a half. So you will see the timer down the bottom here. So, and I'm also using the energy kicks on the exhaust rate of rise as a way to help guide me through the end of the roast as well. So based on experience as well, it's really important to remember when you have a small amount of coffee rolling around in the drum, you actually do need to use a slightly higher gas percentage on, I should say, in the context of my roaster anyway. And I really loved also how Rob said, I do also work on 100% airflow because it gives me a lot more greater control at the end of the roast. And it allows me to have plenty of room and plenty of heat management at the end. So I'm doing pretty much my last adjustment at my last exhaust kick here. And then I think I'm pulling out at 209.9. I think I went just a little bit longer on this roast and then we're done. So end of roast is there. Awesome. So hopefully just seeing that roast in progress and seeing the thought processes and things that hopefully you can apply in your own roasting in terms of really planning out your roast, knowing where you want to be at a certain time with a specific rate. And then you then design your heat management strategy and then you drive from point to point at the right rate. So hopefully just watching that really helped, to show you some really great ways to think through, know the intention, know the end flavor goal, always remember the green that you're roasting. And then of course, based on your batch size and the machine that you're roasting on. Now, for those of you who don't have software, there is actually nothing wrong. I know a lot of us all start with using pen and paper. So I just jumped there. So, this is what a manual profile would look like if it was mapped out accordingly. I actually quite like using manual profiles because it allows me to I really like having something tangible to look at and hold, and especially like seeing the rate of rise numbers from minute to minute, and then like mapping out the stages. And then on the left here, I have a plan of attack of what I would like to do with my heat management strategy in terms of gas adjustments and machine adjustments. And then down the bottom is actually what actually happened during the roast. So, and then you can then, if you don't like something in this profile, you can fix it pretty quickly and see, well, what gas adjustment was I at and what can you change next time if you did want to improve on that roast. And speaking of which, so this is what I would be showing myself at the end of a roast. So you can see up the top, I've got my roast log information and I'm giving myself some ticks and crosses, and I'm using my parameters chart as my guide. How did I go in terms of my data points? And then of course, yes, please make sure you then, I'm definitely not saying just because your data checks out that you don't need to taste. Of course, 100% always taste. But things that I would do differently next time. This is only the second time I've roasted this coffee. So next time I roast this coffee, I would work on a heat management strategy just to make sure that I don't exceed 4 minutes 15 in the Maillard time, and maybe then bring in my color change time a little bit earlier. But as far as the other points in terms of post first crack, degrees, my ratio and my weight losses and in my color checking, I was really happy with that. So this is a really great way, you can use these tools to show yourself and arm yourself with better decisions. So yeah, more than anything, know the purpose of your roast, know your green, know your machine, know your profile and your heat cooking strategy, know your intended flavors, and collect the right data and back yourself, and always taste and confirm. And that's me. So yeah, a really big thank you to Roast Magazine and to Connie for the wonderful opportunity to present. And yeah, any questions, don't hesitate to reach out, by email. Yeah, and hopefully, yeah, you can be more decisive roasters.